Thank you for joining us as we take a few moments to celebrate Hispanic Heritage. It took 2 presidential proclamations to officially recognize Hispanic Heritage Month. Washington, D.C. correspondent Alexander Limon talks to immigration activists about the history of the month and how the celebration is being observed.
Hispanic Heritage Month celebrates the culture and contributions of Hispanics to the United States of America.
It has been in place since Lyndon B. Johnson, and it was expanded under President Reagan.
Rafael Medina with the Center for American Progress says Hispanic Heritage Month started as a week-long observance and was expanded to a month-long celebration in the 1980s.
Since then, every president has signed a proclamation beginning in September 15, and it goes until October 15.
But Medina says 2018 has been a difficult year for Hispanics. He points to the White House and President Trump.
I think it's very clear that he's very insensitive and doesn't actually care about the Hispanic community.
Medina says even the annual Hispanic Heritage Month proclamation has been tarnished.
Last year, President Trump signed the proclamation right after he had rescinded the program DACA.
DACA is the program that protects young immigrants who were brought into the United States illegally as children. The program's future is still uncertain, and Hispanics have also felt the effects of the president's zero-tolerance policy.
Thousands of families, hundreds of children remain separated from their parents at the border.
Chris Shimolensky is the deputy director for Numbers USA, an organization that strives to reduce total immigration numbers. He says it's possible to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month and at the same time enforce immigration laws.
While the administration has implemented a zero-tolerance policy along the southern border, it's not targeted at Hispanics. It's anybody who crosses the border illegally is going to be prosecuted.
Shimolensky agrees Hispanics have done much to shape American culture.
There are thousands, millions of Hispanics that have come to this country legally and have contributed over generations and made, again, viable contributions to the United States, and I do think we should celebrate that.
On this, Medina agrees. In fact, he says it's now more important than ever to remember all that Hispanics bring to life in America.
For Hispanic Americans who still believe in the American dream, who still believe in inclusivity, in culture, to not grow apathetic and to register to vote.
He also wants to celebrate all that Hispanics will contribute in the future. In Washington, Alexandra Limon.
Danny Quintana's journey began in New Mexico, but as a child, he and his family moved to Utah. That's where he eventually earned a law degree and where he continues to work the halls of justice for his clients. News for Utah's Marcos Ortiz caught up with Quintana, who, after all these years, is still going strong.
Danny Quintana is a busy man. Not only is he an attorney, but he's also an author of many books, including this one of his Hispanic ancestry. He's also a humanitarian. All this while in a wheelchair.
I've always loved tennis. I used to be good, now I'm old. Whether you're in a wheelchair or whether you're not in a wheelchair, it's really important to watch your diet and exercise.
Danny Quintana wasn't always in a wheelchair. A neurological disease crippled him when he went to college in the 1980s.
Suicide is something that people will think about.
But having a son at an early age made him realize someone depends on you.
I think whether you're in a wheelchair or whether you're able-bodied, you have to really, really become a part of your children's lives.
And that thought was the driving force for Quintana to get a law degree from the University of Utah.
Well, I'm a die-hard believer in the legal system. I believe the legal system works, and I think that law is the only way that you can have peace in a society and in our world. I firmly believe that if we work hard and if people are just honest with the courts, that, yeah, it does work.
Quintana's journey began in New Mexico. He was part of a large Hispanic family whose ancestors go back to the Spanish settlers who colonized the area. For him, life was good, and his Hispanic heritage started taking shape.
In New Mexico, you'd speak English in the classrooms and Spanish in the playgrounds, and you spoke Spanish at home.
He was raised by his grandmother after his mother died at an early age. His father moved to Tooele to work at the Army Depot. Then his father sent for him. The comforts of his large Hispanic family were behind him. Culture shock set in.
Because the cultures are so different. You have that Spanish Catholic culture, and then you have the Northern European Mormon culture.
Then more hardship. When he was 10, his father was killed by a drunk driver. His white stepmother raised him. At the now closed down Harris Elementary in Tooele, Quintana became an outcast because Spanish was his first language in a nearly all-white school. His grades were sinking, and his teacher wanted to know why.
I looked at her and I had this tear in my eye, and I go, they don't like me because I'm Spanish and I don't speak English. And she goes, well, I like you. And she gave me this great big hug. And that turned me right around.
It's something Quintana has never forgotten. And despite being in a wheelchair, it hasn't stopped him from passing it forward. He's now involved in raising money and rounding up wheelchairs to give to the underprivileged in Mexico and other third world countries.
Well, it really changes their lives, especially the families, and they're grateful. And they say, gracias, gracias a Dios, que Dios te bendiga.
But Quintana isn't stopping there. He's heavily involved in saving the planet. Later this month, he'll be traveling to Europe to meet with community activists there and also visit Spain, the home of his ancestors. In Salt Lake City, Marcus Ortiz reporting.
Coming up, we'll look at the life and legacy of Mexican-American Union leader Cesar Chavez, told through the eyes of his son. Welcome back. You can't take a look at Hispanic heritage without mentioning Mexican-American Union leader Cesar Chavez. He overcame many hurdles in his pursuit for equality for farm workers. His search for a fair treatment of those who place fresh food on our tables led him to become one of the best-known Latino civil rights activists in our history. Amber Frias has more.
Back in the 50s, harsh conditions and little to no consideration for farm workers was normal. Reports from the California State Health Department indicate that between 1950 and 1961, 3,040 farm workers were poisoned by pesticides and other farm chemicals. From those, 22 adults and 63 children died. And according to a report by the National Safety Council, in 1963, agriculture was third in highest work-related deaths. Unfortunately, due to lack of opportunities and low wages, some people chose to work the fields.
It's no fancy ideology.
Cesar Chavez's son Paul remembers what his grandma told his father.
Mijo, you can't go to school anymore. You need to help us feed your brothers and sisters.
His son remembers his exact words.
I vowed to do something about that because I never want another mother to ever have to have that conversation with your children.
Cesar witnessed firsthand the inequalities and hardships farm workers faced.
Things weren't right, that the opportunities that had been offered to other folks in this country weren't being extended to farm workers, and so he was committed to going out and doing something about that.
1952 was the year Cesar Chavez organized the Community Service Organization, a Latino civil rights group. Through this group, he traveled throughout California, delivering speeches to support workers' rights.
He was an ordinary man that had this dream that we all share, that this country would be more open to providing opportunities to all of its residents.
10 years later, Cesar co-founded the National Farm Workers Association with Dolores Huerta, now the United Farm Workers Union.
You have come here at sacrifices to yourself and to your family.
It's important to remember that while he was the face of the organization, there are countless heroes, men and women and children whose names are lost to history that made tremendous sacrifices and accomplished great things.
Through these accomplishments, Cesar's movement inspired movements nationwide that turned into victories for farm workers. And that's not all.
In addition to inspiring people, he knew that you had to go out and make impact in their daily lives. And so there was the work of the UFW that's worked for over 50 years to improve wages and conditions and benefits for farm workers.
Cesar knew the needs of the farm workers didn't end with their shift. Through the UFW, he founded several organizations to help improve their daily lives: a credit union, a burial program, an affordable housing program, an education program, among others. Chavez continued to fight for the people until he died in 1993.
We need to work on housing and help kids with educational problems, and if we do that along with commemorating his life and work, then I think we honor his legacy in a way that he would be most happy with.
You've got to get out there with a picket sign and get some action going.
Amber Frias reporting.
Coming up, we'll explain how Luisa Moreno became one of the best-known civil rights leaders and activists that you've probably never heard of. During this Hispanic History Month, the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. is highlighting the story of Luisa Moreno. She was a civil rights leader and activist that you probably have never even heard of. Alexander Limon reports on Moreno's life and her legacy.
It's a name you probably haven't heard. Blanca Rosa Lopez Rodriguez. She was a labor organizer and a civil rights leader. She fought for Hispanic workers in the United States beginning in the depths of the Great Depression. But Blanca Rosa Lopez Rodriguez changed her name and called herself Luisa Moreno. Even her name became a way to stand with Hispanic labor. In Spanish, Blanca means white and Moreno, brown. Her story is the focus of a new exhibit at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Mireya Loza is the curator who oversaw its installation.
She's just a figure that predates a lot of work that we think is central to labor organizing.
She says Luisa Moreno was born into a wealthy family in Guatemala. She worked as a journalist in Mexico, and she wanted to change the world around her.
And she decides in the U.S. that she will rub shoulders with working class and working poor people and really fight for their rights.
Moreno moved to New York City where she worked as a seamstress, but the low wages and poor working conditions propelled her to help organize several strikes, and that set her life on a path dedicated to fighting for fair labor practices.
And she decides to organize tobacco workers in Florida, pecan shellers in Texas, and cannery workers in California.
Moreno became one of the most prominent labor activists of her time after signing on with the American Federation of Labor, in part because of her powerful writings.
She is a poet and an intellectual, and she is a clever writer and thinker.
Moreno was also key in creating the Spanish-speaking People's Congress, a California-based coalition of Latinos. It was used to lobby Congress for protections for immigrants, like housing and education reforms in the late 1930s and 1940s. But in 1950, the government issued a deportation order for Moreno. They cited her association with the Communist Party as a risk to national security.
And she leaves the U.S. Because they threaten her with deportation because of a lot of her union organizing and her work.
Moreno returned to Mexico, and she lived in communist Cuba. Ultimately, she died in her native Guatemala.
I just think her story is really incredible for this period, and I think she's a really incredible Latina.
Luisa Moreno helped pave the way for future activists like Cesar Chavez to declare, "Yes, we can. Si se puede." In Washington, Alexandra Limon.
Coming up, a look back at how farm workers took on the agribusiness in California and won their fight to create better working conditions. 53 years ago is when one of the most politically powerless groups tried to take on the giant and powerful agribusiness industry of California. It would be farm workers from Delano who eventually brought the growers to the negotiating table to sign labor contracts. Jose Gaspar tells us more about the Great Grape Strike of 1965.
Working in the fields, I was 13 when I first started.
Carolina Franco of Delano has worked in the fields all her life, starting in the 1960s. Conditions for farm workers were tough. Long hours, little pay, no toilets or cold water in the fields.
Mothers had to take their children to the fields. There were no babysitters. There was no way to pay babysitters. And they would put them in their cars, and it was so hot, 100 like now, sometimes 113 degrees. The babies would throw up. They would get so dehydrated.
Farm workers eventually rebelled, demanding better pay, benefits, and better working conditions. On September 8, 1965, it was a group of Filipino farm workers who went on strike against the grape growers. A week later, on September 16th, they were joined by Mexican farm workers under the leadership of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta.
I was working with Shanley, and I kept hearing this about huelga, and I didn't know what the word meant.
Huelga meant strike, but there was a problem. News of the strike wasn't getting out beyond Delano. Chavez came up with a plan. Farm workers would march 340 miles from Delano to the governor's office in Sacramento to demand better working conditions. Roberto Bustos was the captain of the march, He was 23 years old then.
Look at all the people.
77 huelguistas, or strikers, began the march from Delano on March 17, 1966, from the union headquarters on Albany and First Streets. Just 2 blocks from where the march began, the farm workers were stopped here at Garces and Albany Streets by Delano police dressed in riot gear. And for a while, it was a tense standoff.
They said you cannot march in the streets because you don't have a permit. A permit? And that's not true.
Police eventually let the marchers through. Taking the back roads, more people would join the march as it made its way north.
Families came out, farm workers came out, they brought us water, they brought us food, fruits.
But they were also met by hostility.
Oh, insults, yeah. People yell and scream and, go back or to Mexico, whatever, so-and-so, yeah, there were insults, yeah, but that didn't bother us,
But on the picket lines, things turned violent. Carolina Franco recalls one instance where a group of strike breakers chased after her and 2 other farm workers, catching 2 of them.
They beat him up, they ran him over, they kicked him all over, they hit him with shovels and sticks. I mean, they just ran all over the place. They were running.
The strike lasted 5 years. Growers eventually agreed to sign labor contracts with the farm workers union for the first time.
That was a joy. We cried like you wouldn't believe. We were hugging and screaming and jumping up and down in the Filipino hall with all of us crying because we had gotten the first contract.
This is Jose Gaspar reporting.
Coming up, how Spanish and Native culture collided, sometimes violently, to create what is now a rich tradition-filled Spanish colonial life in New Mexico. Welcome back. The initial conversion of what is now New Mexico from a native culture into a blend of Hispanic and Native is really thanks to Spain. The change began in earnest almost 500 years ago with the arrival of the conquistadors. Bob Martin explains.
The long-abandoned Zuni village of Hawiku, walls melted into the landscape, is where New Mexico's Hispanic heritage was born in 1540. Inspired by tales of riches, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's collision with the native world here was violent.
First impression of impacts would be devastating. Of course, forced out of your home, by an attack.
Coronado and others took native food supplies, used forced labor. Hispanic culture began to change native life.
Obviously, if you've never seen a horse or a sheep before, that must have been a shock. But over time, Zunis, I think, and other pueblos and other people in this region accepted some things and rejected some things.
Coronado soon moved to pueblos near Albuquerque. At Coronado State Historic Site, scientists still study the impact of the massive expedition.
That's extremely bad news for a Pueblo population that has to look after those people and the large number of animals they had.
There was more violence, the story still being unraveled.
People come to our site expecting a large statue of Coronado, Coronado Monument, and they think that we're here to glorify that. But actually we're not. We're here to start a dialogue as to what happened during this time period.
Coronado left in 1542, followed in 1598 by Don Juan Oñate. More violence, hundreds of Acoma residents among those killed or maimed. Communities and Catholic churches multiplied.
The most, I believe, lasting presence of the early conquest is the strength of Catholicism in New Mexico, in both the Hispanic communities and in the Pueblo communities.
In 1680, the Pueblos drove the Spanish out, but they and coexistence returned 12 years later. Today, Spanish colonial life in New Mexico can be experienced at Rancho de las Golondrinas near Santa Fe. Oñate brought 4 blacksmiths.
And not a lot of metal was brought up because of the weight. They reused whatever they had.
Carpenters fashioned chairs, wagon wheels, and more.
With an axe, you can build a house. So that's one of the first primary concerns was shelter.
Sheep provided food and wool. Weaving traditions are preserved.
Well, we don't want our culture to die down. We want to keep it going.
We want people to walk away feeling like they've stepped back in history.
Bob Martin, KRQE News 13.
Thank you for spending a little time with us today as we take a look at the hidden history of Hispanic heritage. Have a good night.